at the retreat, and we thought of the whole idea of do not be conformed, you get that there is a bit of a sense of tension. In some way, we want to be conformed because it's easy to be conformed. It's comfortable to be conformed. It is really hard to swim against the current. Anyone who's done that knows how quickly you get tired. And for a lot of us, and especially in a country as the United States or Canada, where conformity is a big deal, okay, how do you fight that? And the tough thing about being in healthcare, which is the position of a lot of us, is that you've got two different sets of values you have to merge. Sometimes they say you're in conflict, but you know what? I'm going to try to make a case it's not. But because you have faith, what you believe in, okay? But also you've got a healing duty. You've got something you're expected to do. And the fact that when you get to see the patient at the end of the day, you know what? For the most part, what the patient wants is like, you know what? I want to be healed. That's what I care about. You could be the lousiest, person in terms of their faith, but the patient wants at the end to be healed. The reality is that this was always a one identity. The identity of the person who brings the spiritual health and the person who brings the physical health was always one. From the time of Moses, when they got the plague at that time, and he told them to look on the bronze serpent, they got healed, but it was also a healing of inside and a healing of outside. In the age of the Old Testament, the priest in the Old Testament was the person who was supposed to be also the physician. And that's why, for example, when they had the skin diseases, the one who would approve or disapprove their entry back was the priest. Because they would know, they would have also that medical knowledge. They can tell, you know what, I'll pray for you and maybe you'll be healed. In the Middle Ages, this was the physician, this was the pharmacist, this was the dentist, this was the priest, this was all in all. In the Middle Ages, this was the figure that combined in it healing. When the person went to this figure, they were healed. Both spirit, both inside and outside. And we all know this is like, you know what, well, if you're sick, what do you do? What does the Bible tell you? Well, you should call the elders of the church to pray over him and anoint him with the oil in the name of the Lord. So for us, it was a certain commandment that that's what we need to do. Unfortunately, in the last century, and this is where I want to get us to this point of, okay, what are the forces that we're struggling with in terms of conformity? All of a sudden, this one identity became separated. And you can see the separation, and I'm going to give you some examples, and I know these examples are extreme, but the extreme usually gives us a little bit of an image of what the separation looks like. Because this subject is very touchy, because you get, for example, this whole phenomena called the faith healers. You see them on TV, you see them this mega conferences, and they go there and people from all over sorts. You know, when I was actually traveling one time from Ethiopia back, there was on the flight, traveling from South Africa to Egypt. Okay, those were a group of 50 Egyptians who had traveled to South Africa for a faith healer in South Africa to be healed, believe it or not. And they were on the flight with us from Ethiopia to Egypt. And the problem with these faith healers is that, you know what, hey, there are people who get healed. I can't deny that. But is that the model that our church teaches? Is that the model that Christ teaches? Because in the same time, you get a girl like this who had pulmonary hypertension when she was young, and her parents believed in faith healing and refused to get her to go to a doctor until she got older and she had irreversible pressures in her lungs and she was dying. She needed a lung transplant. And at that time, she came up and told them, is like, you know what, I wish to see my parents persecuted. In fact, this case started several states in the United States where they started laws to protect kids from their parents who believe in faith healing. In fact, there was another extreme case of a baby who had a hemangioma. It was very treatable when it was young, very treatable. And the parents said, you know what, no, we'll keep praying, we'll keep praying. They took her and they prayed, as you can imagine, until this hemangioma covered the baby's eye and the baby lost their vision. So that's one extreme of the faith healer. You get also this question, and this is where one of the things about this conformity, I'm going to ask you this question because this is going to be a recurring theme today. How do you define a miracle? How do you define a miracle in the 21st century? How do you define a miracle in the 21st century with such scientific advances? How do you define the line of separation between natural and supernatural? How do you define the limits of where the natural ends and the supernatural begins? Because you get, for example, and you know what, we all know because our church believes in the intercession and in the faith healing that happens. But you know what, we also know that happens, that some people, for example, I've known a couple of cases of people who had some sort of cancer, and they prayed, and the cancer, you know what, went away, the cancer shrank. And they believed that they were healed. Could a miracle have happened? Absolutely, there's no doubt. But then lo and behold, after 5 years, the cancer comes back, and it comes back more vicious. And some people look back, well, you know what, when it first came about 5 years ago, if you would have taken chemotherapy, because you all know the microscopic metastases of cancer, if you would have taken chemotherapy, you might have prevented it. So then you'll ask yourself the question, was that first instance a miracle or not? What are the limits of a miracle? What are the limits of what we would call this is acceptable by miraculous standard? And then you get, you know what, science at this point, for whatever it's worth, you know, they're telling you, you guys, as healers, as faith healers, as Christians, as people who believe, you're really full of yourself. Because we know what, we don't need you anymore. We have now decoded the gene, the human genome, and we have figured out ways that we can actually put the right genes in your body and make you to become a superhuman. Only a healthy seed would be sown. So in 100 years from now, we could be as a church kind of struggling with identity of like, okay, what is a human at this point? And the world has completely implanted completely different seeds of what would consider to be the next stage of humanity. And what they're doing in their eyes is miraculous. The problem is that over the years, and this is where I want to take you over a story, that line between natural and supernatural has been pushed a lot. And that's why we get in the 21st century, while we're living a faith of 2,000 years, or even more, because it's a Judeo-Christian faith, that line, which our faith tells us this line is being separated, is being pushed to the limits. And how can we evaluate that? In some sense, you know, you get people who, that separation, when it started, we all know that for a long time in early civilization, people believed that disease and sickness is a mark of what? Evil spirits. Till now, we see in villages that we go, when we go to Africa and we try to even give them modern medicine, we try to give them even a prayer of a priest, you know what they will do? They will reject it and they'll go to the voodoo priest. Why? Because the voodoo priest has direct contact with the evil spirits that cause them this illness. And we as 21st century people kind of get amazed at this and say, you know what, how are these people thinking? But the reality is that that was civilization for a very long time. That disease and sickness was due to evil spirits, health was due that you were good with the gods. So then what you need to do is to offer sacrifices to the gods so you can get the health. It's kind of interesting when you look at the first time, so how did things change? Well, modern science got it, but it's very interesting when you look at the first experiment of how we figured out things. Because when we get sick and the man in the village thinks it's an evil spirit, a man like Semmelweis in the OB ward in Vienna hospital tried to figure out this way because he found out that a lot of women are dying out of fever who are being treated by physicians, okay? And those who are treated by midwives are not dying. I find it interesting, one of the randomized experiments he did at that time was the role of the priest. Because he postulated at that time, well, maybe the priest, when they're coming to them, they get really scared and freak out because they think they're going to die, so they die. So he actually did, you know, a randomized experiment where he actually sent the priest to one and to the other and then alternated, but he didn't find a difference. So he said, you know what, well, I don't think it's the priest then. And the rest you know it, is that, you know what, he found out that is due to contamination of the hands of the medical students and the doctors who were treating the women versus the midwives didn't have that because the doctors and the students will go to the morgue, okay, do their job, and they will get their infection back to the women, and the woman would have the fever and would die. So we know this. But I'm going to challenge you at something. 3,000 years ago, a sickness that would kill Alexander the greatest man who existed at that point, had everything under his arms. It is thought that he died from a fever, from sepsis, from infection. He must have at that time sacrificed to all the gods you can name it. He had all his faith healers at his hands, trying to kind of do everything in their hand and invoking the supernatural to heal him. Now in this day, if any one of you would have the same infection, you would not even think about invoking the supernatural. What would you do? You'll just go to the doctor, take an antibiotic, tomorrow you'll be better. So has God changed? Has the line between natural and supernatural changed? Or has our perception of the role of the supernatural in our health is what changed? I'll leave that question there. You look at the new theories of how King Tut died. And they believe at this point that he died because of a broken leg that got infected and he died from it. At that day, they probably would have invoked all the supernatural powers that you can think of. Versus now, you're able to do surgery inside the uterus on a fetus. I don't know if you guys know about spina bifida, like the problem with the back. They treat it intrauterine right now. So let me ask you this. Is this a miracle? A lot of people would say, you know what? No, that's science. That's not miraculous. That's not miraculous. You look at something like treatment of Hep C, you know, we don't actually feel the impact of that here, but you go to places like Egypt, oh man, oh man. It's very interesting. When you talk to some people here who had the Hep C treatment, they would never think twice about invoking the supernatural or say it's miraculous. You go to Egypt to somebody who's been living with Hep C for 15, 20 years and living in that fear, and he got this medication, and the first word he would tell you, Doc, it was a miracle. Maybe he's referring that the miracle that he got the drug, maybe that he heard the drug costs in the United States hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the fact that he got the drug over there for a cost of price, for him, he considered that it was a miracle that he was able to get that treatment, period. But I find it very interesting how the same treatment is perceived in a country like here versus a country like the US. Restoration of smile. I was actually, last week talking to one of our oral maxillofacial surgeons who works on the trauma service. And the amazing work of reconstruction they can do. I think Mina showed yesterday the cleft palate and how devastating it is. Do you consider that a miracle or not? Those who are in physical therapy, I find it very amazing that now this quadriplegic man is being offered a way to stand up and walk. For those who don't know, the gentleman behind him is a physical therapist. He's Coptic. He's Coptic. This is kind of the first 100% robotic exoskeleton, they call it an exoskeleton, to allow quadriplegic, he's a quadriplegic Marine, to walk. Is that a miracle or not? Is prolongation of life a miracle or not? So as I remember, he told you, this line between natural and supernatural? Just look over the last 20 years. You don't have to be that old like myself and have a 16-year-old kid to know that. But just look at that line of demarcation, how it's pushed. And what this represents to us as a church and as people, when people say, well, you know what, I think it's done. I think it's done. You need to disconnect. And you would say, no, I still think their miracle could happen. Where's the line? I could tell you of a story that happened to me. So in my profession, I've been practicing for the last 14 years as a cardiologist, and I do interventional cardiology, which means taking care of patients with heart attacks and people come in with cardiac arrest. I vividly remember a case where a patient came in. It was July 4th. I remember it because it was a July 4th party. And it was the pastor of a very conservative church in Minneapolis. And the guy had hosted his whole church. The church was like 100 people. So they're all at his house having, the July 4th party and seeing the fireworks. And the guy had a massive cardiac arrest in the garage when he was getting them some soda. And nobody noticed because everyone was in the backyard. And they found him after like 10, 15 minutes, completely out. They started CPR and whatnot. They called the ambulance, 911, came into the hospital, massive heart attack. We did the usual job, did what's called the cooling protocol. Right now, people with cardiac arrest, they cool their body down to preserve the brain function for a period of time. Because at that time, the heart is working, but the brain is not. And then you start warming them up after 4 days to see if they're going to wake up or not. So at that time, I had taken care of this guy. And when I came out from the procedure room, the cath lab, I looked into the waiting area, and the nurse before I was going in told me, you know what, George, be careful. It's like, why? It's like, there's 150 people out there. So I go outside, and the whole church is out. So, I go out and it's like, okay, well, I can't talk to all of you. It's like, where's the wife, please? So before I start talking to the wife tells me, he's like, Doc, before you say a word, do you mind if we pray together? I told her, it's like, sure. So, held hands and they prayed really hard. It was a little bit uncomfortable because some of them started really getting on their knees and they started to, be a little bit too outwardly. And it was, I can't deny, it was a little bit uncomfortable. But I said, you know what? I think it's great to pray because there's a lot of unknowns there. Keep praying. And then after that, I was on vacation after that for 2 weeks, was on a mission trip, and then came back. And after I came back, one of my partners met me in the hallway. He's like, George, you remember this patient you did on July 4th? He's like, yes. Can you go and talk to the family? I was like, so what's happening? So apparently after they warmed him up and they did some brain scans, the guy had 2 EEGs, okay, which is the brain scan. It was completely flat line. It was not even noise. Sometimes like you get noise, you get unspecified things, you can't tell. But this was a flat line and they repeated it twice. And they did a couple of scans on his brain and his brain stem was herniating. It's a done deal. It's a done deal. So I was like, okay, so what's the problem? Well, we tried to tell the family to disconnect and they're refusing. I was like, why? Well, they're still praying. I was like, okay. So they asked me, since I had a bit of a kind of a rapport with them, to go and talk to the wife. So I went to talk to the wife. And I said to her, I was like, it doesn't look good. So I think we should disconnect. And she looked up at me and was like, what are you talking about? I thought you were a Christian. I thought you believed in Jesus. I was like, what does my belief in Jesus got to do with this? Well, don't you believe that Jesus raised Lazarus from the death? So why can't he do it here? I told her, your husband is flatline. And she told me, well, Lazarus was 4 days. She had her answer. She had her Bible. So then I told her, it's like, well, with all due respect, at that time, Jesus did this. It was a sign for something. I'm not sure. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I'm not sure what kind of sign is this. But I told her, at the end, you need to make a decision. Well, she said, you know what? The elders of the church are praying, and they're the ones who are going to tell me about the decision. I'm not making the decision. I said, seriously? You're not one making the decision? Is the elders of the church? I was like, yes. So how long are they praying for? Just so we know we can plan our week. I was like, well, they're saying we're going to give this week prayer. I told her, he's like, you know what? I don't think this is right. Because there is going to come to a point where the hospital is going to ask for an ethics committee, okay? And they're going to get a court order to disconnect. Because you know what? At this point, you are defying nature. But this instance really brought it to my attention at that point, how our perception as Christians of this fine line between natural and supernatural is not the same across all of us. Is not the same. And it's not the same across our Coptic church now and our Coptic church 1,000 years ago. It's not the same as our Coptic church here in the US and our Coptic church in Egypt. But it's a very interesting dichotomy.